The wind was a blade against Elias Thorne's face, sharp and unforgiving. It carried the scent of snow, a promise of the blizzard that was already swallowing the distant peaks of the Tobacco Root Mountains. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, his gaze sweeping the vast, empty expanse of his land. This solitude was a fortress he had built around himself, stone by bitter stone, after the war had taken everything else. The silence was his companion, the harshness of the Montana Territory his only creed. Survival was a simple, brutal equation of work and vigilance, and there was no room in it for another soul. He turned his horse Ajax back toward the small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands. It was little more than a single room, a bulwark against the world. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a lone signal of life in a wilderness that was preparing to unleash its full fury. Yet enough firewood stacked to last through the apocalypse, and enough cured meat and flour to see him to the spring thaw. He was prepared. He was always prepared. It was the one thing he could control. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement against the graying landscape, a splash of dark color on the snow-dusted ground. It was too small for a deer, too deliberate for a coyote. Elias reined Ajax to a halt, his hand instinctively dropping to the stock of the Winchester rifle resting in its scabbard. Trouble came in many forms out here, and he'd learned to greet them all with suspicion. He urged the horse forward at a slow walk, his eyes narrowed against the wind. The shape resolved itself into a figure, stumbling, falling, and rising again with a desperate, painful slowness. A person, alone, on foot, with a blizzard breathing down their neck. It was a death sentence. A part of him, the cold, practical part that had kept him alive for 10 years in this unforgiving place, whispered to turn back. It was not his concern. The wilderness made its own rules and claimed its own victims. To interfere was to invite complication, to risk the sanctity of his isolation. He had left the world of men and their endless troubles behind for a reason. But another part, a deeper, older instinct he thought long buried under layers of grief and cynicism, refused to let him turn away. It was the code of the frontier, perhaps, or a lingering ghost of the man he had been before the cannon fire and the screaming. You did not leave a person to die in the snow. He closed the distance, the crunch of Ajax's hooves on the frozen earth the only sound besides the rising howl of the wind. The figure was a woman. She was wrapped in a dark, travel-worn cloak, the hood having fallen back to reveal hair the color of autumn leaves, now matted with ice and snow. She took another lurching step, her strength finally giving out, and collapsed into a heap on the ground. Elias dismounted, the rifle held loosely in his hand, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He approached cautiously. She was unconscious, her face pale as milk, her lips tinged with blue. One of her hands was clenched around the strap of a small leather satchel, a testament to her last failing effort. He could see she was gently bred. Her clothes, though ruined, were of a finer cut than anything seen in the rough settlements nearby. She was a world away from where she belonged. He swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound lost to the wind. This was precisely the kind of complication he had built his life to avoid. A woman. A lady by the looks of her. She would bring questions, demands, a presence that would shatter the careful quiet of his existence. He stood over her for a long moment, the first flakes of the blizzard beginning to sting his cheeks. He could leave her. Right on. By morning, the snow would have covered her completely, and it would be as if she had never been there. The thought was a cold, sharp stone in his gut. He remembered other faces, pale and still in the mud of Shiloh, faces he had been powerless to help. With a sigh that was more a growl of resignation, he holstered his rifle. He knelt, his movements stiff and reluctant. He slipped his arms beneath her, surprised by how little she weighed. She was a fragile thing, all bone and chill. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his shoulder, and a faint, shuddering breath escaped her lips. The sound was a crack in the ice of his resolve. He had made his choice. He carried her to his horse, mounted with practiced ease, and settled her in front of him, wrapping a corner of his coat around her slight frame. He turned Ajax toward the sanctuary of his cabin, riding into the teeth of the storm with the world in all its messy, unwanted complication, held tight against his chest. Clara Maeve Lowell drifted in a confusing fog of cold and pain. There were moments of jarring awareness, the rough texture of a coat against her cheek, the solid, rhythmic movement beneath her, the low murmur of a man's voice speaking to the horse. But mostly, there was the cold, a deep, invasive chill that seemed to have settled in her very bones. She remembered running, the burning in her lungs, the terror that had propelled her forward long after her body had screamed for rest. She remembered the smirking, possessive face of Judge Sterling, the way he had looked at her as if she were a deed to be signed, a property to be acquired. Her uncle's betrayal had been the final blow. After her father's death, he had become her guardian, and in his greed, he had seen her not as family, but as a commodity. He'd promised her to the judge, a man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty and a grip on the territory's politics as tight as a noose. Her inheritance, her freedom, her future, all sold for a business advantage. Fleeing was her only option. She had taken what little money she could gather and the few keepsakes in her satchel and slipped away from the grand house in Helena, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the wilderness, hoping to reach the next town and lose herself before the judge's men could find her. Now she was lost to a different, more impartial predator, the Montana winter. The fog thickened, pulling her back under. The next time she surfaced, the world was blessedly warm. She was cocooned in heavy wool blankets, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee filling the air. A fire crackled nearby, its light dancing on the rough-hewn log walls of a small room. She was lying on a narrow cot, and her sodden dress and cloak were gone, replaced by a man's long woolen shirt that smelled faintly of pine and clean sweat. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise, but she was too weak to give it voice. She forced her eyes open. The cabin was spare and meticulously organized. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, shelves were neatly stacked with tins and jars, and a rifle rested on a rack above the hearth. It was the home of a man who lived alone and valued order. And there he was. He stood with his back to her, tending to a pot on the cast-iron stove. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements economical and sure. He wore simple denim trousers and a flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms. When he turned, she saw his face. It was a study in severity, carved from hard angles and shadowed by a dark beard. But his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were clear and startlingly direct. They held a deep, unshakable weariness. He saw she was awake. He said nothing, simply ladled a steaming broth into a tin cup and crossed the room. He handed it to her without a word. His hands were calloused and large, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit up, propping a pillow behind her back. Clara's fingers trembled as she took the cup. The warmth seeped into her, chasing away the last of the deep chill. The broth was rich and savory, made from wild game. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank it slowly, feeling strength return with each swallow. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice a dry whisper. He gave a curt nod, his expression unchanging. He took the empty cup from her and returned to the stove. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Outside, the blizzard howled like a wounded animal, rattling the single window pane. Here, inside, was a small circle of warmth and safety. "I am Clara Lowell," she said, feeling the need to fill the void. I was trying to get to Willow Creek." "You were trying to die," he corrected, his voice a low baritone rumble, devoid of judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. "Storm's been coming for 2 days. Only a fool or a fugitive would be out on foot." The word fugitive hung in the air. Clara flinched. "I am not a criminal." He turned to look at her again, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned back to his work. "Didn't say you were." His taciturn nature was both unnerving and, strangely, reassuring. He asked no questions, made no demands. He had saved her life and now seemed content to ignore her. She pulled the blankets tighter, her mind racing. She was trapped here, a guest of this silent, formidable stranger, until the storm passed. And after that? The judge would be searching for her. Her flight had only bought her a little time. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the snow-caked window. The blizzard raged relentlessly, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Elias Thorne, he had offered his name as grudgingly as he offered everything else, fell into a simple routine. He tended the fire, cared for his horse and the attached lean-to, and worked on mending a harness, his hands moving with practiced skill. He spoke little, his presence a solid, quiet weight in the room. Clara, once her strength returned, could not bear to be idle. She was a guest, a burden, and it chafed at her independent spirit. On the second day, while he was outside checking the livestock shed, she rose from the cot. Her own clothes, which he had dried and folded neatly on a stool, were hopelessly tattered. She was still wearing his shirt. Finding a needle and thread in a small wooden box, she set about mending the tears in her dress with tiny, even stitches. When Elias returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he stopped and watched her for a moment, an unreadable expression on his face. He noted the precision of her work, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not the helpless city creature he had first assumed. "There's flour in the bin," he said gruffly, gesturing with his chin. "If you've a mind to." It was not a request, but an acknowledgement, a concession. Clara felt a small victory. She nodded and, after a moment's search, found everything she needed. Soon the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting scent of baking bread. She was clumsy at first in this rustic kitchen, so different from the well-appointed one she was used to, but she was adaptable. She learned the quirks of the wood stove, the heft of the cast-iron skillet. She made biscuits that were light and flaky, and a stew that stretched their supply of salted meat and dried vegetables. They ate their meals in near silence, sitting at the small, rough-hewn table he had built. But the silence began to change. It was no longer heavy and awkward, but companionable, filled with the small sounds of a shared existence. The clink of forks, the crackle of the fire, the steady howl of the wind outside their sanctuary. Clara found herself watching him. She saw the way his brow would crease when he was focused on a task, the surprising gentleness with which he treated his horse, the deep loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Elias, for his part, found his carefully constructed solitude crumbling. The cabin, which had always felt sufficient, now felt full. Her scent, something like lavender and winter air, lingered in the small space. The splash of her reddish gold hair was a bright counterpoint to the muted browns and grays of his world. He found himself listening for the soft rustle of her movements, the quiet hum she sometimes made when she was sewing. He had expected her to be a disruption, and she was, but not in the way he had feared. She brought not chaos, but a quiet order, a sense of domesticity he hadn't realized he'd missed. It was a dangerous feeling. It felt too much like home. One evening, the storm had quieted to a low moan. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara was patching one of his shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. Elias was sharpening a skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a soothing sound in the quiet room. "You're a long way from home," he stated, not looking up from his work. It was the first personal question he had asked. Clara's hands stilled. She looked into the fire, its flames a miniature contained wilderness. "I suppose I don't have a home anymore," she said, her voice soft. "My father passed away 6 months ago. My uncle, he made an arrangement for me, with a man I could not abide." She did not need to elaborate on the sordid details. The starkness of her flight spoke for itself. Elias stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He understood arrangements. He understood men who saw people as property. He had seen it in the war, in the way men were used and discarded like spent cartridges. "So you ran," he said. "It was the only thing I could do," she replied, meeting his eyes. "To remain myself." He gave a slow nod, a flicker of something, respect, understanding, in his expression. He set the knife and stone aside. "The war," he began, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being dredged up from a deep, cold place. "I was at Shiloh. The things I saw there, the things I did, they change a man. When it was over, I couldn't go back. The world felt too loud, too crowded." He stared into the fire, but Clara knew he was seeing something else entirely. "I came out here for the quiet, to be left alone." In that moment, the distance between them vanished. Clara saw past the stoic frontiersman to the wounded soldier beneath. She saw a man haunted by ghosts, just as she was. He had built a fortress against the world not out of misanthropy, but out of pain. He was not a loner by nature, but by necessity. "The quiet can be a blessing," she said softly. "But sometimes the silence can be just as loud as the noise." His eyes met hers across the flickering firelight, and for the first time, he did not look away. He saw not a damsel in distress, but a woman of quiet strength and deep resilience. He saw a survivor, just like him. A bond, unspoken but deeply felt, formed between them in the warm, firelit cabin, a fragile connection forged in the heart of a shared desolation. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface, an awareness of their proximity in the small space, now had a name. It was kinship. And it was far more dangerous to Elias's solitude than simple desire ever could be. He felt a protective instinct rise in him, fierce and unfamiliar. He had brought her here to save her from the storm, but now he found himself wanting to save her from the world that had cast her out. The thought was a complication he could not afford, and a temptation he was no longer sure he could resist. The blizzard finally broke. A brilliant, blinding sun shone down on a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white. The silence that followed the storm was profound, absolute. For Elias, it was the silence he had always craved, but now it felt different. It felt empty. Clara's presence had filled his cabin with a quiet life that he now found indispensable. As the snow began to melt under the relentless sun, a new tension settled over them. Their sanctuary was no longer impenetrable. The world, with all its dangers, could now reach them. Clara's anxiety was a palpable thing. She would often stand at the window, her gaze fixed on the long, empty track that led down from the valley. Elias found himself manufacturing reasons to delay her departure. "The pass will be treacherous for another week," he'd say, his tone flat. Or, "The creek's likely flooded. Too dangerous to cross." They were plausible excuses, but they both knew the real reason. Neither of them was ready for her to leave. He watched her one afternoon as she stood outside, her face tilted up to the sun, a few stray strands of her hair catching the light like spun copper. A feeling he couldn't name, a fierce possessiveness mixed with a deep tenderness, tightened his chest. He had spent years cultivating his isolation, and in a matter of days, this woman had laid siege to it without firing a single shot. He was terrified of the vulnerability she represented, and even more terrified of the thought of returning to the hollow man he was before she arrived. His internal battle came to an abrupt end a few days later. He was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort, when he saw the riders, 2 of them, making their way slowly up the valley. They were not cowboys or trappers. They were dressed in dark town coats and rode with an arrogance that spoke of authority, or at least the belief in it. Elias's body went still. He set the axe down slowly, his gaze never leaving the approaching figures. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked back to the cabin. Clara was at the window, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the frame. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Judge Sterling." "Get in the lean-to," Elias commanded, his voice low and urgent. "And stay quiet. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. She trusted him. She slipped through the interior door that connected to the small stable, just as the riders reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Elias stepped out onto the porch, blocking the doorway with his body. He stood relaxed, his hands empty, but his stance was a clear warning. This was his ground. The lead rider was a portly man in his late 50s, his face florid and accustomed to command. His eyes, small and shrewd, swept over Elias in the cabin with undisguised disdain. This was Judge Abner Sterling. The man beside him was younger, with the hard, empty face of a hired gun. "You there," the judge called out, his voice oily and condescending. "I am Judge Sterling. I'm looking for a young woman, a runaway ward of mine. Reddish hair, slight of build. Answers to the name Clara Lowell. Have you seen her?" Elias met his gaze, his own expression as blank and hard as the mountains behind him. "Haven't seen anyone. Been snowed in for more than a week." The judge's eyes narrowed. "My sources say she fled in this direction. She's a delicate creature, ill-suited for this rustic landscape. It would be in your best interest to be truthful with me, Thorne. I know who you are. The recluse with the prime parcel of bottom land. Title's a bit murky on it, I hear. A man in my position could help clear that up. Or he could complicate it. Indefinitely." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied. He was threatening Elias's land, the one thing he had bled and sweated for, the physical manifestation of his independence. A cold fury, slow and deep, began to burn in Elias's gut. This man thought he could bully and buy his way to anything he wanted, including Clara. "Like I said," Elias repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "I haven't seen her. Now, this is private property. I'd thank you to be on your way." Judge Sterling chuckled, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "Private property is a fluid concept out here, my friend. It's only as private as the law says it is. And I am the law in this territory." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Let me be plain. That girl is my fiancée. She is promised to me. She is, for all intents and purposes, my property. If I find you are hiding her, I will not only strip you of this pathetic little homestead, I will see you rot in a jail cell for obstruction." From inside the lean-to, Clara heard every word. Her blood ran cold. He had called her his property. The casual, absolute ownership in his tone terrified her more than any physical threat. But then she heard Elias's response, and her fear was momentarily eclipsed by a surge of disbelief and a fierce, protective warmth. "She's not your property," Elias said, his voice like the crack of a whip. "And she's not your fiancée. She's my wife." The lie was so audacious, so utterly unexpected, that it stunned even the judge into silence. His florid face darkened with rage. Elias didn't flinch. He stood his ground, a lone sentinel defending his fortress and the woman inside it. "You lie," Sterling hissed. "Do I?" Elias countered, his calm unnerving. "We were married by a circuit preacher before the storm hit. We were just enjoying a bit of privacy. Now I'm telling you for the last time. Get off my land." He had escalated the confrontation to a point of no return. He had not only protected Clara, he had publicly claimed her. In the silence of the lean-to, Clara pressed her hand over her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had lied for her. He had put his home, his freedom, his entire life on the line for her. Judge Sterling stared at Elias for a long, venomous moment, his mind clearly working, weighing his options. He could not easily dispute a marriage without proof, and Elias Thorne did not look like a man who would back down from a fight. "This is not over, Thorne," the judge spat, yanking on his horse's reins. "Not by a long shot. I will look into this marriage, and if I find you've lied to me—" He left the threat hanging in the air, a toxic promise. He wheeled his horse around and, with his hired man, rode back down the valley, leaving a trail of churning mud and menace in his wake. Elias watched them until they were out of sight. The rigid control he'd maintained finally seeped out of him, leaving him with a bone-deep weariness. He had won the skirmish, but he had just declared war. He turned and went back into the cabin. A moment later, Clara emerged from the lean-to, her eyes shining with a complex mix of fear, gratitude, and something he couldn't decipher. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He won't let this go. He'll check the county records. He'll find out you lied." "I know," Elias said, his back to her as he stoked the fire. "He'll take your land. He'll ruin you. All because of me." The guilt in her voice was a heavy weight. Elias turned to face her, his expression grim. "He won't find out I lied," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it's not going to be a lie for long." Clara stared at him, her heart stopping. What are you saying?" He took a breath, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I'm saying we're going to get married, Clara. For real. It's the only way. It's the only way to protect you from him, and the only way to protect this land. A marriage of convenience, a legal shield, nothing more." The proposal hung in the air between them, born of desperation and danger. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem. But as Clara looked at the honorable, lonely man who had just risked everything for her, she knew it was already far more than that. It was a turning point, a crucible where a partnership forged in a blizzard would be hammered into something permanent, something real. Something that might just save them both. The silence in the cabin was thick with the weight of his words. A marriage of convenience. The phrase was cold, practical, a business arrangement designed to thwart a common enemy. But looking at Elias, at the fierce resolve in his winter sky eyes, Clara felt none of that coldness. She saw a man offering her the ultimate protection, leveraging the only thing he had, his name and his home, to build a wall around her. "He will not stop," Clara said, thinking aloud, her voice steadier now. "Judge Sterling believes the world owes him whatever he desires. He sees me as a prize he was denied. He sees your land as an asset he can acquire. Marrying you, it would bind his two problems into one. It would make you his sole focus." "Let him focus," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've faced worse than a blowhard judge in a fancy coat. This is my land. You are under my roof. My protection." He hesitated, the next words costing him more than the first. "If you'll have it." It was not a question of love or affection. It was an offering of sanctuary, a pact of mutual defense. Yet for Clara, it felt like more. In a world that had sought to use and discard her, this quiet, stoic man was offering her a partnership. He was offering her respect. She thought of the alternative, returning to Helena to be consumed by the judge's possessive grasp, or fleeing further into the wilderness, always looking over her shoulder. Here, with this man, she felt something she hadn't felt since her father's death. Safe. A legal shield, she repeated his words, her gaze unwavering. On one condition. Elias's jaw tightened. He was a man who disliked conditions. What is it? That this is a partnership, she said, her voice clear and direct. Not just your name protecting me. We face this together. I will not be a helpless burden in your home. I will contribute. This will be my fight as much as it is yours. My home to defend too. A flicker of surprise, then profound respect moved in his eyes. He had expected her to ask for assurances, for comforts, for an escape clause. Instead, she had demanded to stand with him, not behind him. She was not asking for a savior, but an ally. Agreed, he said, the word a solemn vow. The plan was made with a grim efficiency that belied the monumental life change it represented. Willow Creek was a day's ride away. It had a circuit justice, a man named Miller, who was known to be fair and, more importantly, discreet. They would ride out at dawn. That night, the cabin felt different. The unspoken tension of their forced proximity had been replaced by the acknowledged reality of their impending union. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by a storm. They were about to become husband and wife. Clara lay on her cot, the blankets pulled up to her chin, her mind racing. She was entrusting her life and future to a man she had known for little more than a week. A man who spoke in clipped sentences and whose past was a landscape of shadows. Yet she trusted him implicitly. She trusted his actions, which spoke far louder than any words of affection could. He was honorable to his core. Elias sat by the dying fire, long after Clara's breathing had evened out into sleep. He stared into the embers, the rifle across his lap. He had invited the world back into his fortress, and now he was chaining himself to it. To her. He told himself it was a practical matter, a legal strategy. But as he listened to the soft sound of her breathing, a sound that had already become as integral to the cabin as the creak of the logs, he knew it was a lie. He was binding himself to her not just to save his land, but because the thought of his life without her in it had become unbearable. The silence he had once cherished now loomed as a desolate emptiness he never wanted to return to. They set out at first light. The air was crisp and cold, the world a brilliant expanse of white and blue. Elias rode Ajax, and he had procured a gentle mare from a small herd he kept for Clara. They rode mostly in silence, the only sounds the crunch of hooves in the snow and the jingle of harness. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of two people moving with a single purpose. Willow Creek was little more than a main street carved from the mud, lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the small office of the Justice of the Peace. Elias led them to a livery first, ensuring the horses were cared for before they attended to their own business. Justice Miller was an old man with kind eyes and a fringe of white hair. He looked at them over the top of his spectacles as they stood before his cluttered desk. "Elias Thorne," Miller said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Didn't figure you for the marrying kind." "Circumstances change, Jasper," Elias said gruffly. "This is Clara Lowell. We need you to make it official." The justice looked from Elias's grim face to Clara's composed one. He was a wise man, accustomed to the strange and sudden arrangements of the frontier. He saw the lack of frippery, the absence of a wedding dress or joyous family, but he also saw the fierce protectiveness in Elias's stance and the quiet resolve in Clara's eyes. He sensed the urgency and asked no prying questions. He drew out the necessary papers and a worn Bible. The ceremony was brief, the words simple and ancient. They stood side by side, Clara's hand resting lightly on Elias's arm. When Miller pronounced them man and wife, the reality of it settled over them. "You may kiss your bride, son," the justice prompted gently. Elias turned to Clara. Her face was tilted up toward his, her expression unreadable, but her eyes full of a soft, questioning light. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was part of the performance, the necessary proof for the official record. But as he leaned down, all thoughts of performance vanished. He gently cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her soft skin. He touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was brief, chaste, and yet it sent a tremor through them both. It was the sealing of their pact, a moment of profound connection that went far beyond any legal document. It was the first tentative acknowledgement of the truth they had both been avoiding. This was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage of the heart, whether they were ready to admit it or not. When he pulled back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were shining. He dropped his hand, the air between them crackling with unspoken emotion. They signed the register, Elias's bold, dark script next to Clara's elegant hand. Justice Miller signed as the witness. It was done. Clara Lowell was now Clara Thorne. She had a new name, a husband, and a home to defend. As they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight of the street, the world felt both the same and irrevocably different. Elias purchased supplies at the general store, more flour, coffee, and, to Clara's surprise, a bolt of sturdy blue wool fabric and several skeins of yarn. He didn't explain the purchase, simply loaded it onto the pack mule with the rest of their things. The ride back to the homestead was quieter than the ride in. They were now bound by law, their fates intertwined. Clara rode beside him, stealing glances at his stern profile. Her husband. The word was a strange, foreign thing in her mind. He was still the silent stranger who had saved her from the storm, but now he was also the man who had given her his name. Elias felt her gaze on him. He kept his own eyes fixed forward, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had done what was necessary. He had fortified his position, but in doing so, he had opened the door to a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. A future filled with the warmth of another person, with shared meals and quiet conversations. A future with Clara. It was a future that was now under direct threat from Judge Sterling. The marriage was not an end to their troubles, but the beginning of the real fight. And as they rode up the valley toward the small cabin that was now their shared home, he knew he would burn the world to the ground before he let anyone take it, or her, from him. The days that followed their return to the cabin were filled with a strange and delicate sense of newness. They were husband and wife, yet They were still learning the landscape of each other's habits and histories. Clara moved her few belongings from the cot to a small chest near the main bed. Elias had built the bed frame himself, a sturdy pine construction that dominated one side of the room. The first night, an awkward tension had filled the space between them. Elias had laid out a bedroll for himself by the fire without a word. "That is not necessary," Clara had said quietly, her voice stopping him as he turned to get his blanket. "We agreed this would be a partnership, a real one. I will not have my husband sleeping on the floor of his own home." Elias had looked at her, then at the bed, then back at her. He understood her meaning. A marriage in name only would be suspect. For their story to hold, they had to live as husband and wife in all visible respects. But her invitation was more than just practical. It was an act of trust, a confirmation of the pact they had made. He gave a slow, deliberate nod and unrolled his bedding on the far side of the mattress, leaving a respectable distance between them. Sleep did not come easily to him that night, hyper-aware of her presence, of the soft sound of her breathing in the darkness. It was an intimacy that was both deeply comforting and profoundly unsettling to his solitary nature. They fell into a new routine, one colored by their new status. It was a life of shared work. Clara took the bolt of blue wool and, with a skill that impressed him, began sewing herself a durable dress, one suited for the rigors of homestead life. She took over the cooking completely, transforming their simple rations into hearty, flavorful meals. She learned to milk their single cow and churn butter, her hands, once accustomed to embroidery and piano keys, growing strong and capable. Elias, in turn, began to open his world to her. He showed her how to track game, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to properly load and clean a rifle. He was a patient teacher, his instructions concise and practical. He watched as she absorbed every lesson, her quick mind and steady hands proving she was no fragile flower. He was not just protecting her, he was arming her. He was treating her as the partner she had demanded to be. This growing respect deepened the unspoken affection between them. It manifested in small gestures. He would return from checking his trap lines and find a hot cup of coffee waiting for him. She would go to the woodpile and find he had already chopped and stacked enough kindling to last a week. One evening, she found him by the fire, whittling a small piece of pine. He worked in silence, the shavings falling at his feet. The next morning, a small, beautifully carved bird sat on the windowsill, its lines simple but full of life. It was a gift given without a word, and it meant more to Clara than any jewel. But the specter of Judge Sterling loomed over their burgeoning domesticity. They both knew he was not a man to accept defeat. He would be investigating, probing for any weakness in their story. Every distant sound, every rider on the horizon brought a fresh wave of tension. One afternoon, the local sheriff, a tall, rangy man named Brody with a weathered face and honest eyes, rode up to the cabin. Elias met him on the porch, his stance wary. "Thorne," Sheriff Brody said with a nod. "Just making my rounds. Heard you went and got yourself hitched." "News travels," Elias replied non-committally. "It does when Judge Sterling is the one spreading it," the sheriff said, his gaze shrewd. "He's been making inquiries in Helena, raising a fuss with the territorial governor, claiming you abducted his ward." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Elias, her face composed. "I was never his ward, Sheriff. My uncle made an arrangement without my consent. I left of my own free will." Sheriff Brody looked at her, then back at Elias. He saw the way Elias stood slightly in front of her, a protective shield. He saw the wedding band on her finger. He was a good man who had little love for Sterling's brand of high-handed justice. "The judge is a powerful man, Mrs." Brody said, his tone gently warning. "He can make a lot of trouble." "We're aware," Elias said, "but the law is on our side. The marriage is legal." "Legal, yes," the sheriff agreed, "but Sterling doesn't always care about what's legal. He cares about what he wants. He's been talking to the land office, too, pulling up the original survey maps for this valley, looking for a loophole to challenge your claim." This was the attack Elias had been waiting for. His land, the very foundation of his life. "My claim is sound." "I hope so," Brody said, his expression serious. "For your sake. I just came to give you a heads up. Watch your back, Thorne. Both of you." The sheriff's visit confirmed their fears. Sterling was coming at them from two directions, trying to annul the marriage by claiming coercion and trying to strip Elias of his land, leaving them with nothing. The pressure was immense. It would have broken two people bound only by a business arrangement. But for Elias and Clara, it had the opposite effect. It solidified their union, transforming them into a unified front. That night, they sat at the table, a map of the valley spread between them, the original deed to Elias's property beside it. He explained the complex history of the land grant, the overlapping claims from the railroad, the parts that were secure and the parts that were vulnerable. Clara listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My father was a lawyer," she said suddenly. "He taught me a great deal about contracts and property law. May I?" She reached for the deed. Elias pushed it toward her, surprised. He watched as she read the dense legal text, her finger tracing the lines. She asked sharp, intelligent questions, pointing out ambiguities he had overlooked, potential weaknesses he had never considered. For the first time, he was not alone in this fight. He had an ally who was as sharp as she was resilient. As she leaned over the map, the lamplight catching the gold in her hair, a wave of powerful emotion washed over him. It was more than respect, more than attraction. It was a profound, aching love, a feeling he thought had died in him on the battlefield at Shiloh. He loved her intelligence, her courage, her quiet strength. He loved the way she had made his house a home. This marriage, born of convenience, had become the most real and vital thing in his life. The land was no longer just a refuge from the world. It was the ground on which he would build a future with her. And the thought of losing it, of losing her, was a fate he would not accept. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She stopped reading and looked up, her eyes questioning. He said nothing. He couldn't. The words were locked behind years of disciplined silence. But his touch, his gaze, said everything. Clara's heart fluttered. In his touch, she felt the truth he could not speak. She saw the depth of his commitment, the fierceness of his devotion. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. In that simple gesture, their pact was renewed. They were no longer just allies. They were partners in every sense of the word. The threat was real and closing in, but for the first time, neither of them felt truly alone. They had each other, and they would stand and fight for their home together. The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. It began not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. A writer from Willow Creek, a nervous young man from the telegraph office, delivered an official-looking summons. It was from the Territorial Circuit Court, presided over, of course, by Judge Abner Sterling. He was calling a special hearing to review the validity of Elias Thorne's land claim. It was a legal ambush, scheduled for the end of the week. "He's not even trying to hide it," Clara said, her voice tight with anger as she read the document over Elias's shoulder. "He's using his position as a judge to be his own plaintiff and jury." "He thinks we'll run," Elias said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Or that we'll show up and he can humiliate us in his courtroom before stripping us of everything." "So what do we do?" Clara asked, her gaze steady on his face. "We fight," he said simply. He spent the next 2 days gathering every document he possessed, the original deed, tax receipts, letters from the land office. Clara worked alongside him, organizing the papers, her legal knowledge proving invaluable. She found a precedent in an old territorial statute that could strengthen their claim, a loophole Sterling might have missed. Hope, fragile but fierce, began to grow between them. The night before they were to ride to Helena for the hearing, a strange quiet fell over the homestead. The air was heavy, unnaturally still. Elias felt it in his bones, the same instinct that warned of a coming storm or the presence of a predator. "He's not going to wait for the hearing," Elias said, looking out the window into the deepening twilight. "It was a diversion. He's coming here." Clara's blood ran cold. "Tonight?" "Tonight," Elias confirmed. He moved with a calm, deadly purpose, checking his Winchester, then a second rifle. He handed the smaller of the two to Clara. "You know how to use it." "Yes," she said, her hands steady as she took the weapon. It was heavy, but its solid weight was reassuring. "Stay away from the window. The main door is thick oak. They'll likely try the back or the window." He extinguished the main lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim, flickering light of the fire. "I'll take the front. You watch the back door, by the lean-to." They took their positions, the silence in the cabin stretching taut. Outside, the world was dark and quiet. Too quiet. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was clear. She thought of the life she and Elias were building, the small moments of shared peace, the unspoken love that had grown between them. She would not let Sterling destroy it. The first sound was the soft crunch of a boot on gravel. Then another. They were not trying for stealth. They were coming with the arrogance of overwhelming force. A voice boomed from the darkness, Sterling's voice, dripping with malice. "Thorne, I know you're in there. I have a warrant for your arrest. Obstruction of justice. And another for the return of my property." "You have no authority here, Sterling," Elias shouted back, his voice echoing in the night. "You're a judge, not a lawman." "I have the authority I need," Sterling roared. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window frame. The siege had begun. Elias returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive them to cover. The night erupted in a cacophony of shouts and gunfire. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin, the sound terrifyingly solid. Clara pressed herself against the wall near the back door, the rifle clutched in her hands, her breathing shallow. She heard a scraping sound at the rear of the cabin. They were trying to pry the door open. Her moment had come. Taking a deep breath, she raised the rifle as Elias had taught her, bracing it against her shoulder. She aimed at the door, waiting. The wood splintered near the latch. A moment later, the door burst open and a dark figure lunged inside. It was the hired gun she had seen with Sterling, his face a snarl in the dim light. He had not expected to meet resistance from this direction. He saw her at the same moment she pulled the trigger. The rifle's kick was a brutal punch to her shoulder, but her aim was true. The shot caught the man in the leg. He howled in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, his own pistol clattering to the floor. He collapsed in the doorway, clutching his wounded limb. The sudden shot from within the rear of the cabin created a critical diversion. Elias seized the opportunity. He moved to the window, firing 2 quick, precise shots that sent Sterling's other 2 men scrambling for better cover. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice tight with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she called back, her voice shaking but strong. "One is down." A surge of pride and fierce love for her washed over Elias, so powerful it almost staggered him. She was his partner. She was a fighter. Enraged, Sterling himself charged the front porch, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of fury. "You will not have her!" he screamed, a man driven mad by his own entitlement. He fired wildly at the door. Elias knew he couldn't stay inside. Sterling had to be stopped, permanently. In a calculated risk, he flung the door open and charged out, tackling the larger man and sending them both tumbling off the porch and into the dirt. They wrestled on the ground, a desperate, grunting struggle. Sterling was surprisingly strong, fueled by rage. His pistol had been knocked from his hand, but he clawed at Elias's face, trying to reach for the knife on his own belt. Elias fought with a cold, contained fury, the skills of hand-to-hand combat learned in the war returning with lethal muscle memory. Just as Sterling's fingers closed around the hilt of his knife, the sound of approaching horses thundered up the valley. A voice cut through the night, sharp and authoritative. "Drop your weapons!" "This is the sheriff's office." Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies galloped into the yard, rifles raised. Sterling froze, his face a picture of disbelief and thwarted rage. Elias used the moment to land a hard blow to the judge's jaw, dazing him. The fight was over. Sterling's hired men, seeing the arrival of the law, surrendered immediately. Brody dismounted and hauled the sputtering, furious judge to his feet. "Sterling," the sheriff said, his voice laced with disgust. "Attempted murder, assault, abuse of your office. I'd say your career is over, along with your freedom." Brody looked over at Elias, who was getting to his feet, bruised but victorious. Then his gaze went to the cabin door, where Clara stood, the rifle still in her hands, her face pale but resolute. He saw the wounded man she had taken down. "Looks like you 2 can handle your own troubles," the sheriff said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "But I'm glad I got here in time to handle the paperwork." The threat was finally, definitively neutralized. As the sheriff and his men led the disgraced judge and his hired guns away, a profound silence descended once more on the homestead. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had just transpired. Elias turned to Clara. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, assuring himself she was real. She was safe. "You were incredible," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on just as tightly. "We did it," she whispered into his chest. "We defended our home." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands framing her face. The last of his reservations, the final walls around his heart, had been obliterated in the heat of the battle. The love he felt for her was too powerful to remain unspoken. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with feeling. "This marriage, it wasn't just to save the land, and it wasn't just for convenience." He took a breath, the words finally breaking free. "I love you. I think I have since the moment you baked bread in my kitchen and made this place feel like a home again." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, tears of relief and overwhelming joy. "Oh, Elias," she breathed, her hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. "I love you too. I think I have since you stood on this porch and lied to a powerful judge, all to protect a stranger you'd rescued from a storm." The declaration, so long overdue, hung between them, more beautiful and binding than any legal document or spoken vow. The danger had passed, the external threat vanquished, and in the aftermath, standing in the ruins of the fight, they found the true beginning of their life together. Elias lowered his head and kissed her, not with the chaste promise of their wedding day, but with all the passion and love and relief that had been held back for so long. It was a kiss that sealed not just a partnership, but a profound and unshakable love, forged in a blizzard, tested by fire, and destined to last a lifetime. 7 years later, the sun cast long golden rays across a valley that had been transformed. The small, solitary cabin still stood, but it was no longer alone. It was now the heart of a thriving ranch, with a large, sturdy barn, sprawling corrals, and a second story that had been added to the main house. The land that Elias had once defended out of a need for solitude was now the foundation of a bustling, prosperous life. Elias stood on the expanded porch, his arm around Clara's waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where their third child was growing. The sound of laughter drifted up from the creek, where their 2 older children, a 6-year-old boy named Samuel with his father's steady eyes, and a 4-year-old girl named Rose with her mother's fiery hair, were chasing frogs under the watchful eye of Ajax, now a gray-muzzled and dignified old horse. "Sheriff Brody is retiring next month," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a peaceful contentment. "He said he's recommending his deputy for the position. A good man." "He is," Elias agreed. Brody had become a good friend over the years, a frequent visitor for Sunday dinner. Judge Sterling had died in a territorial prison a few years back, a bitter, forgotten man. His threat was a distant memory, a story they would one day tell their children about the founding of their home. Elias looked down at his wife. The years had only deepened her beauty, adding laugh lines around her eyes and a serene confidence to her bearing. She was no longer the desperate fugitive he had found in the snow, nor was he the haunted recluse who had rescued her. They had saved each other. She had drawn him out of his shell of grief, and he had given her a place to stand and fight, a place to belong. "I was thinking about the new schoolhouse," Clara said, her mind always moving, always planning. Her dream of bringing proper education to the children of the valley was finally becoming a reality, funded by the success of their ranch. We have the lumber, and the men have volunteered their time. We can break ground next week." "Whatever you need," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He would deny her nothing. Her dreams were his dreams now. He remembered the man he used to be, a man who believed survival meant being alone, that strength was found in isolation. How wrong he had been. True strength, he had learned, was in partnership. It was in the shared burdens and celebrated joys, in the quiet comfort of another's presence in the night. It was in building something together that was greater than what either of them could have built alone. He had married her to save his land, a desperate, practical measure. But in the end, she had become the reason the land was worth saving. She had transformed it from a parcel of dirt and timber into a home, a legacy, a future. She had become the only reason he had not lost himself. He turned and gently kissed her, a familiar, loving gesture that still held the spark of that first, desperate kiss in the justice's office. Samuel shouted from the creek, holding up a jar with a triumphant cry. Rose clapped her hands, her laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. Elias held his wife closer, his heart full. This was his life now. It was loud, it was messy, and it was crowded with love. The silence he had once craved was gone, replaced by something infinitely better. He looked out over his family, his thriving ranch, his home. He was no longer a man in a fortress. He was a man who was, finally and completely, free.